Hello, I'm Dr. John Smelcer, and welcome to another episode of Ahtna Mythology. Um, you know, most of the stories I will record here come from my book, Trickster, which is a collection of only myths from my tribe, but they can also be found in my book, The Raven and the Totem. And there's an older book that's out of print now called In the Shadows of Mountains, because Ahtna country is surrounded by mountains. I want to tell you two monster stories today, two. So I'm first going to tell you the Tazlina Lake Monster. And it's like a Loch Ness Monster from Scotland. It's very similar in a lot of ways. You know, Canada has these kind of stories. Anytime there's a big lake, there's stories of monsters that live in it. Well, this story comes from my grandmother, Mary Smelcer, who was Mary Jo when she was young. And it comes from Tazlina Lake. And her sister, my grandma's sister, Maury, second chief, and her husband, Joe, second chief, lived on Mendiltna Creek, which empties, which pours into Tazlina Lake. And Maury and Joe lived there most of their adult life, and Joe lived to be like 95, so a long time. Anyhow, I've been down to Tazlina Lake a few times, and there used to be a village there. My grandma and her family and relatives used to live there on Tazlina Lake Village, especially like in the summers. And one day, my grandma remembers way back, she was a little girl, maybe 8 or so. Her dad had been out hunting for caribou on the lake. He had his kayak or his canoe, and he was paddling around, and all of a sudden, a giant fish, I mean a monster fish, something longer than his canoe. Imagine how big that is. Came right up to his canoe, and he saw it from really close up, and he came running back to the village telling everybody that there was a monster. My grandma clearly remembered that day, and they said that the monster, and there's all these stories of these monster fish, so big they eat caribou, like baby caribou swimming in the water, and you know, they can eat almost anything big enough to swallow. They're gigantic. Over the years, I learned that sturgeon, the same fish that swim like up in the Columbia River to the Columbia Dam, they can grow to be 16 feet long. 16! That's gigantic. And they can weigh like 1,000 pounds, and they're very prehistoric looking, very prehistoric. I imagine that's what my grandfather saw all those years ago. But that reminds me of another story. My Uncle Herb used to tell us the story of the ice worm, the giant ice worm that lived in glaciers. Well, you know, it always just sounded like a myth, like a legend, like, it's just fairy tale. But he told us the story one day when we were moose hunting in the fall. Boy, it must have been like 1975 or something. I must have been in my teens. And he told us the story, because we could see the glacier in the distance when we were setting up moose camp. And that night around the campfire, he told us the story of the giant ice worms that live in glaciers. I remember it was a super cold night, and my brother and I were freezing in our sleeping bags in the tent. It was super cold. But he told us how there's this giant worm, I mean giant, that slithers in the holes that are in glaciers, and it comes out and sometimes eats caribou and sheep, all sheep, and if people are unlucky enough, it catches people. And I was like, wow, that's scary. Well, decades later, when I was an adult doing research, I was on some glaciers. I was on the Matanuska Glacier, in fact, which is right at the edge of our traditional territory. And I saw, in the middle of summer, these little tiny worms. And they were tiny, but they were all over on the top of a glacier. Think it's hundreds and hundreds and maybe 1,000 feet thick of solid ice. What would live on a glacier? But here are these little worms squirming around. I talked to biologists. Turns out that there are these little worms that live in glaciers, and they come out to get the pollen that blows in from surrounding mountains, and it settles on the glacier surface, and these worms come up and eat it. So there was like a little truth to the story of the ice worms. They just weren't giant and didn't eat people and caribou and all sheep. Hope you enjoyed these stories.